Hey everybody, it's Professor Parish. I hope you all have had a wonderful week and weekend. We are going to talk about week 8 of English 122. If you can believe it, we are at midterms. Midterms. Now, midterms are going to be a little bit different in English 122 with how our semester has been scheduled. So I'm going to talk about our schedule for this week. We're going to finish talking about, we're going to talk about 3 chapters of poetry, and then next week you guys will finish up the discussion on poetry with me in our PowerPoints. But let's dive in and look at our course content for week 8. So the reason I say it's a little different is that if you scroll down on course content to weeks 8 and 9, week 8, this is technically our midterm week. So you'll notice on here, you do not have a discussion forum this week. We're going to take a break from the discussion forums. You all have been doing so wonderfully on your posts. Your posts, your responses, they've all been so well constructed, detailed. They've answered all the questions. You all have done a really good job with the discussion forum as a whole. So we're taking a break from that this week since it's midterm. You'll notice we don't have a midterm quote-unquote exam. That's why I'm going to talk about week 9. But for this week, you have 2 assignments. They are both due on Sunday, so there's nothing due Friday. On Sunday, there is a grammar checkup due and the reading response number 3 due. Now, the reading response number 3, the directions are right here. You will need your textbook. It's basically going to that first set of glossy pages, kind of reminiscent of what we did on our discussion forum last week. And then you are choosing 2 image poem combos. And in your response, you are answering the 3 questions about those 2 image poem combinations. And you are also putting that together in the form of a response. So it's kind of like an extension of our discussion forum from last week. Should be a very easy reading response, and it should give you some more chances to creatively talk about how poetry and imagery work together. And I'm hoping if you watch this video and you see my discussion about the chapters we're going to go over this week, that maybe some of that terminology from these latest 3 chapters, you can incorporate that into your reading response. That's the hope anyway. The other assignment is the grammar checkup. Now we had the grammar sampler at the start of the semester, and this is the checkup. So in the assignment, you will see that there are bits and pieces of information about apostrophes and quotation marks, about commas and semicolons, and then the MLA review. Now, you'll notice on here that it's asking you to write down the formula for how to cite a book and how to cite a web page and a web article in MLA. And then below, it's asking how do you do in-text citations, which we did not exactly cover in the grammar sampler. So I've not talked about the MLA citation presentation yet. I've wanted to see if you can incorporate, if you can read the presentation and read your Cengage handbook and incorporate that use of MLA into here without me directly discussing it. But don't worry, I'm going to go over that presentation and talk more about it. But for this grammar checkup, I want to see what you already know. I want to see if you already know MLA, and if not, if you can look at that presentation and decipher it without me having to go over it. So if you're wondering where that presentation is, it is in our resources and handouts, and it's in week 1. So it's this MLA citation presentation. It goes over MLA, it goes over in-text citations. It pretty much covers everything you need to know about MLA for this semester. I am going to go over this presentation this semester, just not yet. So we're going to wait a little bit longer before I go over it. But I want to see for this grammar checkup if you can understand it without me having to explain it. And if you already have somewhat of a base knowledge about MLA. Now, if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. But that's the grammar checkup. Now, you may be asking, well, what about our poetry paper? What about our exam for poetry? That's not going to be until week 9. So you are getting an extra week to work on your paper, and we're going to finish discussing poetry next week. The way this semester works, usually we have our grammar checkup and everything after this point, after we turn in paper 2 and after we do our exam. But the way that we started late this semester, midterms fell a week early. So that's why. So your final draft will be due next week, October 18th, and the poetry exam and our discussion forum will be next week in week 9 as well. So that's why it's a little bit different than normal. Now, for week 8, this week, not only do you have your grammar checkup and your reading response number 3 due, but if you've decided to revise paper 1, some of you have already turned these revisions in, that's great. But if you decide to revise paper 1, you can make those revisions and email me those changes by this Sunday. After this Sunday, you will not get a chance to revise paper 1 since we're moving on to the other papers. But if you want to revise, it's totally optional, but you have that opportunity if you want to email me your revisions this week or by Sunday at the latest to get your grade hopefully improved on paper 1. So with that being said, in our resources and handouts, we are going to talk about chapters 16, 17, and 18. I want to point out that in week, let me pull it up here. In week 7, you have 2 examples of a poetry paper. One is using option 2, which means you use your own pictures, and one is option 1 where you're just comparing and contrasting 2 songs or 2 poems. So you can click on either one of those examples and see a student paper from the past and how they've done that. So if you're curious on how to structure your paper or what it needs to look like, especially if you chose option 2, I would look at this example paper and you can kind of see how they did it, because I think the format they chose is a pretty good choice. But we're going to go to week 8 and click on this part 2 presentation. We're not going to go through this entire slideshow. We are only going through slides 1 through 7 tonight. So I'm recording this Sunday night, so that's why I said tonight. So we are going to save chapters 19, 20, 21, and 22 for next week, and we'll finish out poetry with those. So chapter 16 is all about symbolism, and our textbook really only has one term that I think is important to note, and that's allegory. Allegory is just a set of symbols that work together. So places, colors, things that can have double meanings, things that can have multiple meanings can be linked to an allegory. And the glossy pages on page 762 and on show kind of how the symbolism can be used within pictures and poems. Chapter 17 is all about words and the web of language. So the idea behind this chapter is to explain just how do poets get language to be at its best. And the big thing is that poets are stickler for words. They are very picky about what word they use. When they're rhyming, they want to make sure they pick the correct word. If they're making a haiku, they want to make sure that they get the syllables right and that it makes sense. I mean, poets are constantly trying to find the best word possible to fit. And it's kind of like, instead of writing a novel where you're writing thousands of words, poets are more keen on which specific word they use per line. So it's much more finite and specific in what they're looking for. They have a keen ear for the emotional quality of words. So again, in the prose section, we looked at connotation versus denotation, the dictionary definition versus the emotional meaning, and poets are really trying to strive for that connotation, that emotional meaning behind the words. They understand the difference in tone. I like our textbook's definition of tone as the attitude created by words. I think that's really a good way of putting it. And it's very telling. Like, you can tell a tone of a poem just by what language is being used within that poem. Are they using short, choppy words, like they're rushed? Are they being flowery and fragrant with their words and using all these lavish, sophisticated terms? Or are they just being like choppy and straight to the point? Archaic language is language that's outdated. So you'll probably notice, I know some of you are using Shakespeare's sonnets as poems that you're comparing and contrasting for your paper. You'll probably see words that don't sound familiar, or Shakespeare was known for using a lot of inside jokes in his writing. So phrases and words that would make sense to somebody that lived in the 1400s, but not now. So that kind of is archaic language that you'll find. And it can make poems hard to understand because it's like we're reading an inside joke that we're not a part of, right? And poets also have a keen ear for the sounds of words. So onomatopoeia, we've talked about that, words that sound like they're spelled. Poetic diction is the more refined and elegant speech. And then there's circumlocution, which is the phrase that takes the long way around. So again, like I said, in our prose section, a lot of these terms were the foundation, of terminology for literature. And as you can see here, we're starting to bring those terms back around, only we're using them for poetry instead of prose. Also with chapter 17, dialects, the ways that we tell where poems are created from. So if a poet is using like a Scottish accent in their poetry, then you can kind of tell where that poem takes place. So on page 795, there's actually a Gaelic poem that when you read it out loud, you'll find that your voice is starting to sound like it kind of has a Scottish accent. And that's because they're actually using language to get that effect. Alliteration, this is probably my favorite term in poetry. I love alliteration. It's just repetition of the same sound at the beginning of several words in a line. So I love using alliteration in creating titles of poems because I think it's so much fun and it sounds classy and cool. I was on the speech team here at SIC, so we did a lot of speech warm-ups, and to get your voice and your mouth movements all stretched out and warmed up when you're about to give a 10-minute long speech. So for example, some uses of alliteration that we would do would be something like, she sells seashells by the seashore. It has that same, like, the SCC she sound. The she sells seashells by the seashore. In the movie Anchorman, Ron Burgundy's character is a news anchor, so he does a lot of vocal stretches, and he's like, how now, brown cow? And that's alliteration. Or the Human Torch was denied a bank loan. Not so much that one, but you can kind of get a common one that we see when we're kids is Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. So say that 5 times fast. That's alliteration. So it's a lot of fun to kind of create these phrases where the words have the same sounds at the beginning of them. But that's a poetry term. So on your exam, you will be asked about alliteration. Just know that it's my favorite term and that's what it means. And then chapter 18 is all going over rhyme, meter, and stanza again. We've talked about these terms in poetry already, but it really breaks them down in this chapter, like in exceedingly good detail. So they talk about end rhyme and internal rhyme. End rhyme is what we normally think of when we think of poetry. It's very Dr. Seuss. It's the last word of the line rhymes with the last word in another line. So roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. So blue and you rhyme. Internal rhyme, though, on page 811, is where the rhymes happen within the line of poetry rather than at the end of it. And that's a little less common of a stylistic choice, but it's still one you can use in writing your own poetry. Meter and stanza are viewed on page 807. There's the term closed couplets that's talked about, which is where 2 lines have self-containing rhymes. And then we have multiple rhymes, which is where more than 2 lines rhyme. Now, this term, multiple rhymes, will be on your exam. I'm going to ask for the definition, which is where more than 2 lines rhyme. And I'm going to ask you for an example of single, double, and triple rhymes. So with single, you have something like moon, soon, 1 syllable each. Moon, soon, blue, true. Double rhymes is balloon, saloon. And then triple's a little bit harder, but it's 3 syllables. Extrovert, introvert. So I'm going to ask you for some examples of that along with a definition on your exam. So you can come up with whatever single, double, triple rhymes you want as long as you include that example in your actual exam. Assonance. Assonance is similar to half or slant rhymes. It sounds more like an echo of a word than actually being similar or rhyming. So for example, break and fade or mice and fight. Neither of those are really half or slant rhymes, but they're assonances because their vowel sounds are similar. So with break and fade, they have that high A sound. So that break, fade, they have that A, that upper A sound. And then mice and fight have that same I sound to them too. So they're not really rhyming, but the vowels have a similar echoey sound to them that a lot of poets, if they're trying to like skirt the line, they'll be like, oh yeah, it's assonances, just throw them in there. It sounds poetic. It's just a stylistic choice. A lot of open form poetry will use assonances because They seem like poetry. They seem like the rhyme scheme, but it's not really there. Anapest is when there's two unstressed syllables in a foot. So, like with iambic, the last syllable stressed. In anapest, there's just no stress at all. It's pretty much read. And then trochaic versus iambic. Trochaic is where stress is on the first syllable, and iambic is stress on the second syllable of a foot in poetry. And then this last slide with chapter 18, there's just some more terms that are talked about. Chapter 18, I didn't put all the terms from chapter 18 in here with form because there's so many. And honestly, if you all go through the chapter, find what terms are going to work for your discussion of your poems that you've either created or you're analyzing, because all of those terms in the book will work. It's just what's going to work for you. This last slide here, slide 7, the last one we're going to look at tonight, is honestly, these are the terms that are probably the most popular that are used. You don't have to use them, but they're the most popular. Dactyl is when there's two unstressed syllables after a stressed one, so there's actually 3 syllables involved with a dactyl use of meter. Blank verse is when there's unrhymed lines of poetry in a sonnet. Pentameter is when there's 5 stressed syllables in a line of poetry. It's a lot of stress in a pentameter or pentameter. And then a villanelle. I like villanelle. I just like this term because it's just a folk poem or a country song is a villanelle. It's just a very southern sounding term. And the last 2 ones on here are different types of ballads. So ballads are longer poems. They're longer than lyrics. They're not quite epics. They're not quite that big of a poem like Beowulf. Beowulf's an epic poem. They're not quite that big, but they're big enough. So a popular ballad is like an extended lyric or an extended song. So I would think of songs like Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin. That's more of a popular ballad. Champagne Supernova by Oasis, that would be another popular ballad. A literary ballad, though, is not necessarily a song, but it's more like a poem that reads like prose. It has a question and answer style to it. And the one that I think of that comes to mind most commonly is the Misty Mountain song that the dwarves sing in The Hobbit. I think that one, it has a very prose-like structure to it. It's a song, but it's almost like a spoken song. It doesn't really have like a big chorus or a bridge or something like that. It's very much like a spoken, sing-songy poem that's being told in that story. So that's more of a literary ballad. So that's all we'll talk about with these poetry chapters. Like I said, 16, 17, and 18 are really just terminology that are stylistic choices. So I'm hoping in your reading response 3 and in your papers that some of these terms you can find useful for comparing and contrasting the poems that you're analyzing. And then chapters 19 through 22 we'll go over next week and finish up with those. So I know I went through that very quickly. If you have any questions about chapters 16, 17, and 18, about our assignments, or about revisions, please email me and let me know. I know that the campus will be closed on Friday and the afternoon for in-service, and then Monday next week we won't have any school on campus because of Columbus Day. But please let me know if you have any questions. I will be happy to answer them. In the meantime, I hope you all stay safe, have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you all again very soon. Bye.